Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are on this beautiful planet of ours. Welcome to Sustainability in Your Ear, the podcast conversation about accelerating the transition to a sustainable, carbon neutral society. And I'm your host, Mitch Ratcliffe. Thanks for joining the conversation today. We're going to be talking with an old friend of mine. As the climate crisis deepens and the extractive economy continues to deplete Earth's resilience, a growing movement is asking a different set of questions. What if regeneration, not mitigation, was our organizing principle? What if we stopped trying to fix broken systems and instead designed entirely new ones rooted in reciprocity, well-being, and planetary health based on regenerative, agricultural, and living practices? That's the quest at the heart of Brenna Simmons-St. Onge work. She's a system strategist, regenerative futurist, and founder of Be the Light Consulting. And I met Brenna while collaborating with New Day Impact Investing's Climate Week programming back in 2024. She isn't just advocating for change, she's living it, trying through experimentation and visits to regenerative communities around the world to embody a whole system approach to transformation rooted in lived experience, wisdom, and deep ecological respect. Brenna's project, which she calls the Regenerative World Quest, is a 3-year journey that she and her family are taking to travel the world to identify, amplify, and help replicate the most promising regenerative communities and projects on Earth. So you can take these ideas and apply them at home. From Costa Rica to South Africa, she's engaging with leaders, learning from indigenous knowledge holders, and documenting models that regenerate land, restore community agency, and reconnect people to purpose. The project is the basis for an upcoming documentary series and playbook that others can use to live lightly on the planet. So we're going to explore what regeneration means in practice and how Brenna navigates the boundaries between storytelling and systems design, as well as the lessons that she's gathering from the front lines of a better future that's already beginning to bloom. You can follow Brenna's journey at bethelightconsulting.com. Be the Light Consulting is all one word, no space, no dash. Be the Light Consulting. We're going to get to the conversation with Brenna right after a quick commercial break. Welcome to the show, Brenna. How you doing? You've been on the road.
I'm doing great, Mitch. Thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be talking with you today amidst the ever increasing crazy times we're living in. How are you?
Well, crazy times are par for the course, and I guess in my life, but it seems like in everybody's these days, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
But you're turning to the future, and that's one of the things I appreciate about you. I have to ask, what inspired you to embark on a regenerative world quest?
Well, thank you for that question. There are many layers of that inspiration, many different moments of clarity and frustration that ultimately manifested in us, like I say, pulling out of the matrix and going on a 3-year regenerative world quest with our family. So the first thing that I'll share is, humans are really creatures of narrative. We
Mhm.
are shaped by story, and that is how human culture has evolved over the thousands of years that we've been on this beautiful planet. And when I think of, and this comes from a very, Western colonized context, but when I think of the dominant narrative that is out there right now, it's Hollywood painting one apocalyptic picture of our future after the next, whether it's AI takeover or the zombie apocalypse, or then you flip to the news and the news just splatters the headlines with kind of the dark side of humanity and what's going on in all the systems that shape and govern our lives. And it doesn't give us a very positive, optimistic picture of human character or of the future that we're headed towards. And that's one harsh realization that we live in today. And the other belief that I have is that we are creatures that of manifestation, meaning what we focus on grows. So
Mhm.
if what we're focusing on is the dominant narrative of our time, shaped by Hollywood and the news, then that is what we're going to collectively manifest. So that is just a hard reality that we live in every single day. The other thing to share with the motivation for the quest is my husband and I, we've been together almost 19 years. And when we were first together, we always dreamed about what does it really look like to live in right relationship with ourselves, each other, and the natural world. And we are constantly searching for that throughout our life's adventures and always thinking about potentially starting or joining an intentional regenerative living community. And it was always sometime in the future, sometime in the future. And after we had our second kiddo during the pandemic, he was born October 2020, we realized no one's really promising us the future. No one's promising us tomorrow. And we have to be the change we want to see in the world. So that was another big reality for us, is recognizing that it's not someday in the future where regenerative living is important. It's right now and it's today. The other realization was after spending about 10 years in corporate social responsibility and then 9 years as an executive in the nonprofit world, doing systems level change. I was always working and fighting for change out there, changing the systems that shape and govern our lives, and was able to make a lot of great impact in the world. But it wasn't necessarily as deep or as robust or as authentic as I really wanted it to be. So I'll give you one example. As the executive director of the Alliance for Collective Action, we passed 66 state laws in Colorado in 3 years and directed over $1 billion of the ARPA funding towards regenerative solutions in Colorado. And a lot of those right now are stalemated. Their funding is cut, they're not able to be implemented, or they're caught in regulation. And so even though we put all of this effort and all of this work into getting policy wins, the actual impact on the ground wasn't happening. And so at the end of the day, we really recognize that we have to be the change we want to see in the world. And in order to do that, we needed to completely change our lives to align with our values. So it took us about 12 months of planning after we agreed that this is something that we wanted to do. And in May of 2024, we officially launched. We took the big leap, pulled out of the matrix, and moved to a farm in Lyons, Colorado.
My wife and I have been together 38 years, so twice as long as you. But we're still finding that choice is always a vital one that we have to make. And we moved into the mountains a few years ago in order to live more closely and in better harmony with nature. It's interesting that so many people are starting to experience that, or maybe it's just our little clutch of people. But I'm wondering, was there a moment where you said, "That's it, we have to do it"? What was that moment like?
Hmm.
Scary?
A little scary. I think there's when it comes to, is it scary? I think for me, there's four different ways of knowing. And I'll get back to your other question, I promise. But with those four different ways of knowing, one of them is analytical. And in my analytical brain, it's still scary now. It's scary every single day when you're only knowing from a pure sense of analytics. But part of what I've been cultivating in myself is looking at four ways of knowing. So your analytical knowledge, your intuitive knowledge, your somatic knowledge in your body, and your emotional knowledge as well. And when I only tune into the analytical way of knowing, it's very scary. And I still question it today. And when I look at this holistic way of knowing and moving through the world, it feels so right to do what
Mhm.
we're doing. It feels like my purpose path, my life's calling. So you asked, was there one moment? It was really a series of moments. And then there was one very clarifying moment that's very vulnerable and heartbreaking, that I'll share with you. But from the series of moments, my husband and I both had very successful careers. And on paper, we were successful. We checked all the boxes of the American upper middle class family, rocking it in our careers and having two kids and a white picket fence and all of those items. But what we noticed was year after year, our quality of life was actually going downhill. And the more money we made, the more stressful we were. And while we appeared successful on paper, our well-being was not where we wanted it to be. And so I
Yeah.
think that was a series of kind of awakenings that we had. And at first, you go to a cocktail party, you go out socializing, and people ask you how you are, and you're like, "Oh, I'm great." And you talk about these trips or what you're doing or what your kids are doing in school. And it's kind of these surface level connections that
Mhm.
are really easy to have. And there was one summer where Matt and I made, my husband's name is Matt. We made a promise to each other. We said, next time we go out and someone asks us how we are, let's be honest. And so that happened at a party. And I said, we're not okay. We're, here are all the different things that we're going through. And I could tell my friend's face. She didn't know how to respond at first. And she kind of put on the mask. And then a few minutes into the conversation, she let down that veil and really connected with me on a deep, authentic level that they were going through all those challenges too. And so I think it was this awakening of, hey, success on paper is not actually the well-being and the quality of life we're looking for. If we are just measuring wealth by money in our bank account, we're missing out on a whole other dimensions of what this life can really offer. And the more that we're able to be honest with each other and honest with our friends and social group, then we can really awaken to be these full humans. So that was a series of unfoldings. And, at the time I was a CEO of a nonprofit. I was working 60 hours plus a week. I had 2 young sons. It was kind of in the middle of the pandemic, leading these incredible statewide initiatives. And I didn't realize how bad my mental health had gotten. I really didn't. And ultimately, it ended up in my dog passing away in a really tragic accident that was my fault. And um, I had to be it woke me up that day. It really woke me up that I can be fighting for solutions out there in the world. But if I'm not living my own best life and being the solutions and showing my children that path, it's all for naught. And so that tragic event happened August of 2023. And after that, I could not continue to live my life the same way. And so it was that day that we decided we had to make a big change. And we didn't know exactly what it was going to be, but we knew it was going to be as values aligned as possible and in the context of regeneration. And the more we started talking to people about what became the Regenerative World Quest, the more support it garnered. And people kept saying to me, that's my dream too. That's what I want to do too. And then the other response would be, oh, Brenna, that's a beautiful vision for the future, but that's never going to happen. You're such a dreamer. And so that made me really go, well, wait a second. It's actually already happening all over the world. And so I started to do research and I realized that there are thousands of communities living all over the world right now that are living the solutions that we need, but they're not getting the coverage, right? It goes back to media and Hollywood being this dominant narrative of the doomsday side of humanity. And there's so much good in humanity that's happening right now as we talk. And so it became this passion of mine to find these projects, find these communities, learn from them, and uplift them and help people see that regenerative living is not some utopian dream 200 years in the future. It's actually happening right now as we talk.
First, thank you very much for sharing that. I really appreciate you doing so with us. There's a lot to unpack in what you just said, but
Mm.
you talked about life being driven by narratives. I'm curious, and I'm going to ask this assumptively, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, please. I would assume that life in a regenerative community is fairly quiet, which is the antithesis of what Hollywood and the front page of the newspaper, well, website, care about. What's the new narrative?
Hmm. That's a really profound question. I think that really is contextual. It depends on
Yeah.
culture and where you are and your own lived perspective. But I think from a climate science perspective, so I spent about 12 years of my career in CSR deeply entrenched in climate science. And a lot of my peers, and I would even talk about how humans are a virus and we're, replicating like we do in a petri dish, and we're just all out for our own good, and we're extracting and consuming Earth's resources. And, I think that really is a colonial capitalistic narrative where humans are here, and in some ways it's organized religion as well. Humans are here to have dominion over Earth, to manage Earth's resources for our own benefit. And that has resulted in a very consumerism, extractive, exploitive narrative that then it comes from a lack scarcity mentality that there's not enough. And for you to get yours, I can't get mine. And if I'm going to get mine, I have to take it away from you.
Mhm.
And so I think that the new narrative, and actually I think the true narrative of human nature, is one of love, is one of abundance, is one of possibility and opportunity and hope. And what does it mean to come together in community to uplift each other and to understand that there is enough? And really also a new narrative about when is it enough? Because there's this obsession with consumerism. And I see it even in my young children now,
Mhm.
where they'll get hooked on, going to Target and they see all these toys in the toy aisle and they're almost paralyzed to pick one toy because they want them all. And so I think we've bred this culture of consuming as much as possible, and the person who dies with the most toys wins. And I think that's really a false narrative. So I think the new narrative is one of integration. And, the other thing that takes a little bit to set up, but I'm going to go there because it feels like it wants to be shared, is I feel like humans have been on this journey of separation. And it really started after the last ice age, kind of in the last agricultural revolution. and
Mhm.
all the other main ages and stages of human development. And again, this comes from a very colonized context, from the agricultural revolution to the religious revolution, the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, and now the tech revolution, are all these revolutions of separating human connection from self, connection from spirituality, connection from nature, connection from each other. And each of them did it in their own way, right? Religion really separated man from nature and man from woman. And the scientific revolution broke everything down into its smallest bits and bobs and studied it in a petri dish. But we forgot to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And so we've been living.
We looked at the parts, not the system.
Exactly. And so I think to be more concise, I think the new narrative is one of deep integration and deep connection. And that's where I hope we're at right now, is the age of regeneration, the age of integration. It's, as many thought leaders will put it, in the great turning back to connection with each other, connection with nature. And that's really indigenous knowledge. That's really an ancient way of being, is that deep integration with all living things.
It's interesting you use the phrase back to it. I actually think of it as forward to it.
Hmm.
It is not a retrograde motion. It's the thing we need to move toward. And compared, say, to the end of the last ice age, we have profound connectivity in the planet. And
Mhm.
it's something new, and we can go deeper. But again, then the question is whether or not you're providing access and connectivity to everybody, and especially those indigenous communities. And I want to talk more about that in a little bit. But let me ask you this. You're taking your kids along on these trips. How are they being changed by it?
Oh, it is transformational for them. Our older son, Louis, turned 8 while we were in Costa Rica, and our younger son, Tucker, is 4. And it's really interesting to see how they move through the world now with this
Mhm.
experience. And it's also really beautiful to see the quest through their eyes, where, I'll give some specific examples. In Costa Rica, as a parent from the United States, we're constantly teaching our kids stranger danger and don't talk to people you don't know, and don't go out of my eyesight when we're in public, and kind of trying to always protect and shelter our children. And when we went to Costa Rica, that just had to go out like right away. We go out to these social settings and we're trying to control our kids and keep them where they should be, and they're wild children, so they went off and about. But seeing how communities there embraced them was so
Mhm.
heartwarming. And it just broke our heart open with joy to see how they were received for who they truly are, and see how they were able to build authentic connection in that way, with land, with animals, with the environment, and also with humans. And so it's been truly beautiful. We homeschool them while we travel, which, I'm not going to lie, is very challenging. Probably the
Mhm.
hardest part of all of it is the homeschooling of the kiddos. But we're able to do it in a really immersive way. And so building the homeschool curriculum around where we're going and the climate and the culture and the history of place has been really, really rewarding for me as a mom, and also for our kiddos. And it's been beautiful to see them grow up in that way. And, we're kind of at the beginning, we're about a year into it. So I'm excited to see as they continue to grow and evolve on the quest. And it's also been a major motivating factor for it. When I think about what school, and my mom's a teacher, so was a teacher, so I don't mean any disregard to our educators. They are, very important to our future. But when I look at kind of the industrial complex of education and what education is my children would be receiving right now, and kind of like the industrial complex, like I said, it is only teaching part of a human, and it really focuses on that analytical way of knowing. And I feel like it's kind of grooming these capitalistic soldiers to be good cogs in these well-oiled machines. But humans are not machines. We're living systems. And so it was really an intentional motivation for us, is how do we raise whole children, whole humans, in a living systems approach, while also teaching them the rugged skills they're going to need for the system stress that we're currently facing right now. How do you grow your own food? How do you filter your own water? How do you make your own shelter? How do you interact with people in a multicultural, diverse setting? And so really looking at raising rugged, resilient children that can be self-sufficient for the future that we're moving into.
There's a lot of paradoxical perception in what you just said. To be both rugged and gentle and connected and interdependent and so forth. And as I think about what you were talking about, yeah, we are living systems individually. We're systems within systems within systems within systems
Exactly.
above and downstream from us too. And I know that stranger danger concern. And I remember one time, my wife and I, when our son was less than a year old, went to a restaurant in Baton Rouge, where I come from. And the waitress picked up my son from his high seat and started to play with him and said, "He's so cute. Look at his little toofies." I remember she said, "His little toofies." And she walked into the
Mhm.
kitchen with our son. And my wife and I went, "Holy smoke." But we just let it go. And we had this really wonderful interaction with her and the cook. And it was really great. The communities that you're like in Costa Rica,
Mhm.
talk about how the other adults interacted with your kids. What was that like?
Yeah. It was similar to your experience. And I feel like it's important to say Tucker, our youngest, he's 4, has like this strawberry blonde, red blonde hair that's really rare down there. And so he would always attract people, especially the locals that always come up and, people we don't know, don't even know us. They'll just go up and start touching his hair and want to hug him and kiss him. And Tucker is very social as well. And so he, would always embrace that affection. And they were very receiving of them. Louis, our oldest, is extremely intelligent. His IQ is off the charts, and he has really high intensity energy, ADHD off the charts. The child
Mhm.
psychologist told us if they could give a higher score for ADHD, they would. And he wasn't medicated at the time. And so his energy, particularly in the United States, is received in kind of a curt way, and he overwhelms people very, very quickly. When we were in Costa Rica, people couldn't get enough of him. It was just so much fun. And they're always, and part of it is we are outdoors all the time,
Sure.
right? And so people would take him on adventures and take him on hikes and go over to the pool and go to the beach and go in the rainforest. And it felt like we had a team of people who loved our children from the moment they first met them. And they were so warm and so loving and so accepting and almost entertained by the energy that our family brings. Whereas sometimes I feel like in the United States, it can be a lot to handle. We're a high intensity unit. And so it was really beautiful to see just the open arms that we were received with. And we toured 10 different projects, and that was common among all the projects. And the other commonality that I think led to the experience we had was that it's such an international
Mhm.
diversity there, where people from all over the world were in these communities and we were interacting with. And English was a common language, but English was one of many languages spoken. So we would be at gatherings and you'd hear 6 or 7 different languages spoke all around you, and people from all over the world. And it was this melting pot of culture, and all of it came from a very heart open space, and especially in support of the youth and our kiddos.
Like a restaurant in Europe. I always love that. Let me turn
Yeah.
to what we came here to talk about, but this has been really a lot of fun to dig into. What is a regenerative community? Describe how you identified them and how did
Hmm.
you choose where you were going to go?
Yeah. There's a couple layers to that. So first, everyone kind of has a different uh, definition of regeneration. And for me, regeneration simply means healing. It means helping to make things better than how you found them.
Mhm.
Whereas a lot of times sustainability is like maintaining, right? How do we have the same inputs and outputs and maintain things? Whereas regeneration is really about healing and improving. And with that, for us, regenerative living is living in right relationship with self, with one another, and with the natural world.
Yes,
And so
it's
that's
not just an environmental, it's so much more.
correct. Yes. And that's very contextual, right? And so what is right relationship in any given setting? It's not always going to be a cookie cutter answer. And in fact, it shouldn't be. It's
Yeah.
it's very much understanding what are all the systems at play, and how do we um, create conditions in which all life can thrive. That's regeneration. And so, as we're looking at what is real regenerative living, I've had the great honor of studying under a lot of the regenerative thought leaders like Kate Raworth and Hunter Levins and John Fullerton and Carol Sanders and um, not Daniela Metters or Buckminster Fuller, but I read and studied them deeply throughout my career. And the reason why I shared that is because I've had the honor of learning from regenerative thought leaders and practitioners, and then from that, understanding the different frameworks that they operate within. And through that, developed an 11-point framework for regenerative communities that covers things like circular economic flows, energy self-sufficiency, how do we value all life from our elders to our youth? Do we put elderly and the youth in these care facilities and kind of have them on the fringes of society, or do we
Yeah.
deeply integrate their knowledge and respect them and intentionally actually connect those multi-generational wisdom keepers? Things like resilient infrastructure. And at the end of the day, I think regenerative living really is solutions-based living for how do we live in a way that addresses the wicked problems we face today, from the economy to inequality to climate change to biodiversity loss, while also adapting constantly to the changing forces that are at play. So all of that really came to help us understand the criteria and how we're developing regenerative living frameworks. And I think the other thing to say from a very just honest, vulnerable perspective is the more we learn about this, the more I know I don't know. And it's, less about identifying, here's all these metric driven solutions that we can define and put a nice bow on, and more about looking at this as an experiment, as the next evolutionary leap for humanity. So that's kind of the framework of which we approached all of this. And then from that, started doing lots of research and looking at where in the world are these communities existing. And like I said earlier, there are thousands, tens of
Yeah.
thousands of them all over the world. And it became very clear in the research very early on that Costa Rica is actually one of the highest concentrations of these communities. And so I started going, okay, what's happening in Costa Rica and why Costa Rica? And there's lots of reasons for that. One of which I think is because of the climate, right? It's like a tropical paradise there, and people go there for vacation and have a wonderful time and kind of get that taste of pura vida, the good life. But the other thing is Costa Rica is demilitarized. And has been for many, many decades. And if you think of the trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars that the US government puts into the military, Costa Rican government took all of that money and put it into welfare and education and healthcare and conservation. And so they actually have kind of a regenerative lens to government there. And, not necessarily saying that's happening currently or into the future, but the history of Costa Rica has been demilitarized. And they have a huge focus on conservation and environmentalism. In fact, 5% of the world's biodiversity is in Costa Rica, and it's a teeny tiny little country.
Yeah.
So it became really clear that there's something magical happening in Costa Rica. It's got a pretty stable government, pretty stable economy, and a beautiful, beautiful climate. So it was clear that that was going to be the first kind of international leg of the journey. And through that, you can Google it and come up with lots of different communities that come up. And it's one thing to read about it on a computer, and it's a completely another thing to experience it yourself in the immersive way that we've had the privilege and honor of doing earlier this year. So that's kind of where we started. I had probably 50 different communities that we were considering to go to. And then that's when that 11-point framework that I mentioned a
Mhm.
few moments ago came into place. So it's, okay, here's all the list of all the communities. Let's look at it through this lens of true regeneration. And what are some of the ones that seem like they're kind of the best in class? And that gave us 7 different projects that we were going to visit in Costa Rica. And when we went there, we ended up being referred to several others. So we ended up checking out 10 of them. And I'm so glad that we held space for those last 3, because they were really some of my favorite projects and some of, I think, the best examples of real regenerative living. And then the last thing I'll say to that, how we selected them, this project is actually fiscally sponsored by Savory Institute, Savory International. So they don't actually fund the project, but it is run through a nonprofit so that we can fundraise in support of the quest. And Savory has 50 hubs all over the world, international hubs, and they're all built on the premise of regenerative agriculture, holistic grazing, and how do we build community resilience around agriculture. And so throughout Savory's network, I was also able to be introduced and connected to lots of movers and shakers in the regenerative ag space in Costa Rica that helped kind of guide the quest sites that we selected.
This is an amazing conversation. We need to take a quick commercial break. We're going to be right back. Stay tuned, folks. Now let's return to the conversation with Brenna Simmons-St. She is a regenerative on, not is, she is on a regenerative world quest to collect and share restorative practices that can heal the environment and our society. Brenna, you've talked about these communities. You've seen at least a dozen of them now in Costa Rica alone. What are the common challenges that these communities have living in this world that we live in, the highly transactional world where you have to be rugged to get by?
Mm. Yeah, that's a really good question. And that's actually one of the many research questions we asked founders and residents and all the projects. And some of them varied and, were kind of nuanced depending on each person's own individual journey. And there were some real common threads that were very obvious kind of right off the bat. And one of them is, how do you hold space for such multicultural diversity when you're bringing people together from countries all over the world who didn't know each other? They all had their own cultural heritage, their own background, their own way of knowing, their own way of being. And now they're uprooted and moved, and intentionally, right? They did this on their own, moving to live together in community. And different cultures, like in Latin America and the United States versus Africa or Australia or New Zealand or Europe, we all have our own ways of operating and kind of quote unquote social norms that are acceptable or not acceptable. And so that was something that we saw a lot of, was in these cultural rich melting pots, how governance structures work in a way that honors each individual culture, but also uniquely has to honor place. Because remember, these are not necessarily deep rooted in their indigenous lands. These are folks who are moving internationally to live in a new land. And so that, I think, goes into the next one is what does it mean to be of a place when you're an expat? And what does it mean to honor the history of the place? In this example, Costa Rica, the indigenous knowledge, the natural life, Costa Rica's history in and of itself, but then also have your own identity as an expat. And so I think that was a really interesting challenge that was in all of these communities. And I think that goes, I would be remiss without mentioning what's happening with displacement of locals when there are expats moving around the world. And to be really honest, a lot of, if not most of the communities we're in order to do this, to pull out of the matrix, move your family across the world, you have to be at some level of economic stability to do that. And then when you're moving into these communities, a lot of time the projects were on previously degraded cattle ranches where there's economic downturn all around the areas because of what's happened. And so they're buying these lands in kind of areas of poverty, increasing the value of the land. And then is this just the next stage of global gentrification, where people are looking for these values aligned lives, but they're displacing locals from their native homelands and then building these beautiful resort-like communities. And then the locals are displaced, or, in some situations. And I guess I should preface it by saying, of the 10 we visited, we saw anything from these rich gated expat communities that were truly the next stage of global gentrification that had a garden and called it regenerative, to cults, all the way up to the real deal of regenerative living, where it's done with true values alignment and true honor of place and culture as well. So we saw everything within that spectrum. And those, each part in that spectrum can have its own challenges as well. Some of them we saw, well, I won't go into that because I don't want to paint it a bad light. So cut that out of the podcast.
I'll leave that because I think that reflects exactly how challenging some of this is. It's not this is a right decision. We can't say it's the right decision, but
Yeah.
it's hard. You used a phrase earlier, to be of a place, and this is a question I've asked a number of people, and you've spent time around indigenous communities, and I've phrased it the following way: how do you become indigenous to a place when you aren't of that place by heritage? And I mean small I indigenous, to be very clear, but to know and become immersed in that place. I'm doing this on 2 acres in the Southern Cascades, learning all the rocks, all the soil, all the bugs, all the animals, what, the salmon runs in the river, everything, the trout runs. It's only the beginning of what an indigenous wisdom is built on. But how have you begun to explore that?
Yeah, I think that's a really deep question and something that I ponder a lot, and some days feel very hopeful and inspired by that journey, and others am very self-reflective of, my own role in that whole kind of displacement. So, I think you touched on it yourself, is how do you become of a place? I think is understanding first who you are and what you value and what is uniquely you that you will not waver or trade. while also deeply devoting yourself to the study, the love, the reciprocity, and the honoring of the place that you're in. What is its history? And not quote unquote his story from the colonial textbooks, but what is the true story, the true
Yeah.
history of people there? And what is the story through the indigenous lens? What is the story through the animals, through the geology of place?
Mhm.
And really, it's taking that responsibility to know a place, to honor the place, and to give back to it. To look at how do I give more than I take in every single day in every setting, and how do I deeply honor this place, and how do I change to meet the needs of the place and the community that I'm now honored to be in, versus expecting the community and the place to change to meet your needs. Right.
Yeah.
And we saw this a lot in the really touristy areas of Costa Rica, where they'll have like a sign like nachos as big as your ass, and like here is pizza, and here, and it's all this adapting to market to the American or the United States tourist, because in the very tourism context, you want to go and you want all your needs to be met, and you expect there to be food that you like there.
Yeah.
And that's almost the opposite of being of a place. That's exploiting a place. And so I think it's really deeply familiarizing yourself with culture, with place, and understanding how you can give back more than you take. And how can you come from a learning mindset and really deeply try to connect with the systems in the local area, as opposed to impose your own knowledge there.
So, having learned and reflected on your learning, what indigenous lessons do you think you've learned that you could translate to actions we could all take wherever we are?
Yeah. Well, I would say firstly that concepts and principles of regeneration really are ancient ways of being, and they are indigenous. They are deeply rooted in indigenous practices. And so it's not some new thing that scientists just discovered, right? This is actually indigenous knowledge that we are remembering again, that many
Yes.
of us have been not intentionally ourselves, but from the quote unquote larger society, intentionally disconnected from these ways of being. And I think, maybe two lessons that I'll share. And we've been talking about this a lot, but one is the deep interconnectedness with all life, with every single life force in the entire universe is connected. And when you pull a string over here, it's going to impact something over here. And it's this giant tapestry, this gorgeous tapestry of rich biodiversity and life and energy and life force that flows through all things in the universe, that is woven together. There is nothing that's separate or siloed. It is all woven together. And I think that is one of the first things that I would say. And then the second big knowledge or second big awakening that I've been blessed to have, and this is something I feel like I intuitively knew as a child, but able to really put words to it now, is the life force that flows through all things, right? A rock is alive, trees are alive, soil is alive. There is more biodiversity in 1 teaspoon of soil than there is humans on Earth. And so really recognizing that it's not just human life that's valued and that's important. It is all life, and all things are alive, and all things are connected. So I think those are two really poignant, powerful learnings and awakenings that I carry with me through the Indigenous lens.
When you think about what you said, I recognize that interdependence is seen as vulnerability by most folks,
Mm-hmm.
certainly here in the United States. And that reflects one of the challenges of taking and translating some of these practices into, say, an urban setting. What do you think about the scalability, the ability to actually do this kind of practice in a larger setting, like in a Western city, like in Denver or in the hills above Denver?
Yeah, that's another great question. And I think what I'll start with there is, in my days of CSR and even in the nonprofit days that I had, we were so focused on scaling, 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 scaling. How do we pilot to scale? How do we find something that works and grow it as big as possible? And I think maybe this is another, teaching from nature, or even some indigenous wisdom as well, is that nature doesn't scale, nature replicates.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do we find what works and then replicate it in units that aren't obsessed with growing big, but looking at that context of self-sufficiency and carrying capacity that creates conditions for all life to thrive?
Mm-hmm.
And so when I think about that layered over an urban setting, it's both mind shattering to think about the intense level of transformation humanity is going to go through over the next few decades
Yeah.
to arrive at, and continue to evolve in a regenerative lens. But when I think about it from a lens of application in maybe suburbia, urban, rural, kind of wherever we are, I think it depends on the context of what that is. But since you asked about cities, take lawns, for example. And when you just see lawn after lawn that is perfectly manicured, probably, Roundup used and watering used and these gas-powered lawnmowers, but they don't actually provide a lot of nutrient density or benefit for humanity from an ecological perspective. And so I think I'm really fascinated to imagine what would suburban and urban settings be like if lawns became edible food forests
Mhm.
and we actually recreated all the niches of a canopy. So you have the canopy, the subcanopy, the bushes, the hedges, and all of that was somehow food producing for humans or for animals. And all of that would be able to sequester carbon. And when you have healthy food forests, they can store more water. And so these huge storm rainwater runoff programs would probably be a lot more relieved if there was actually functioning food forests in everybody's backyard. And then that's also food self-security. And it's also more income generating for folks because you're not spending all your money in the grocery stores. And so I think of solutions like that where how can we work with existing infrastructure to kind of move the needle bit by bit in this incremental way, layering in regenerative practices. And the hard truth is we don't have time for incremental change. We need broad scale systemic change right now in order to meet the challenges that we face and the time frame that we have to meet them. And so I also think about what do we look at from a regional planning and zoning perspective? What about large scale real estate developers that have all these kind of cookie cutter real estate projects they just rubber stamp all over the nation? What if those actually had principles of regeneration built in? And we look at the carrying capacity of, let's say, 150 housing units. And what is all the food, the medicine, the healthcare, the education, the water, the energy needed for each of these units to be self-sufficient? And then what if that's what we replicated kind of all
Mhm.
across the
Yeah.
country, all across the world? And of course, it'd have to be nuanced for culture and climate. And so I think about this from both like how do we use existing infrastructure? And then what if we completely rebuilt America using lenses of regeneration in real estate development? And then of course there's ideas every which way and in between. But I think the last thing I'll end on there is also looking at how we're zoning our areas. For example, some of the farms that I work with agricultural zoning want to bring in more elements of co-housing there, but they can't. They can only have so many housing units on these thousands of acres or hundreds of acres of land. And so the people who are doing the farming have to drive hours and hours away to get to the farm to do the labor, and then hours and hours and back home. But the food is right there and there's land right there. And so I think looking at how we're doing planning and zoning in a regional context for not densification in an urban setting to pack thousands and thousands of people into one area, but looking at co-usage of education, healthcare, agriculture, energy, everything that you need within one self-contained unit that then becomes your community. And then those communities aren't in silos. Those communities are deeply connected to each other and can share cultures and ideas and practices and friendships and exchange best practices and cross-pollinate while living very locally in a way that can meet all your own needs within your community as well.
And each with its own character.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. I had a question and you just answered my last question. So I'll ask a different one. You had mentioned several times your background in corporate social responsibility. And of course, I've worked in that space too. We have a lot of assumptions about what we're trying to achieve by being corporately responsible. Based on your experience, how were the assumptions you brought to corporate social responsibility misplaced in the past, and how would you change them today?
Hmm. Ooh. I think first and foremost, there is a really big focus and prioritization in corporate social responsibility for metrics.
Mhm.
And, there's that old adage in management, like you can't manage what you don't measure.
Yep.
And, I think there's benefit in being able to measure a carbon footprint, for example. There's benefit in measuring your supply chain. But I think that there's a lot of flaws in corporate social responsibility. And one of them is just so focused on these metrics that have to be reported and valued every quarter. And, I think a lot of times those produce unintentional incentives to kind of prioritize productivity over the real impact of a company. So I think that was one when my early days, measurements were how we got our bonuses and how we proved that we were doing our job. And it felt really good to have your goals and your numbers come in and, beat your goals. And I think that that took CSR in a really mechanist perspective. Um, I also think a lot of times in CSR, companies that have the biggest budgets can tell the best stories. And again, like we said earlier through this podcast, we're creatures of narrative. And so we're
Yeah.
really moved by stories. And you can paint CSR in a really beautiful way. And that's resulted in a lot of, I think, greenwashing, unfortunately, where you can tell a story about the good a company's doing, but it's not necessarily moving the needle. And I think carbon markets are an example of that. I was really all for them in the early days and then started to work within them and seeing how it's not really doing what we need to from a climate standpoint. And it can be really easy to be double counted or miscounted within how carbon markets are bought and sold and traded.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so, I think there's a lot of good intention there where we want corporations who have some of the largest footprints to take accountability in their actions. But I think that a lot of times the way that the measurements, coming back to that kind of assumption, the way that the measurements are prioritized can be really a false reality.
Well, it's certainly easier to tell a story than make a substantive change to your business.
That
And
is very true.
that's been my experience is they will do a little bit of work and then they'll tell a very big story. You
Exactly.
have a big story and you're going to continue this journey. Can you talk about how to stay connected with your quest and where should people follow your journey?
Yeah, thanks for asking that, Mitch. So we are on all of the social media channels, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, LinkedIn, under the Regenerative World Quest. And so that's probably the best way to follow along. They were posting every week on different elements. And YouTube, if you just go to YouTube and type in the Regenerative World Quest, has a whole collection of videos, short videos from 1 minute to maybe 7 minutes that we've made on the Costa Rica chapter and what we're doing here in Colorado. So that's a great way to stay up to the content. I do a monthly blog as well, which is on my website for bethelightconsulting.com. And then the Regenerative World Quest has its own website as well. So it's the regenerativeworldquest.com. And you can kind of see where our next quest sites are. You can read more about the project. And then if you scroll all the way down to the bottom of that page, there's a contact me button and you can email me and set up a meeting. I'd love to get to know any of you listening out there and love to have you follow us along on the quest.
Brenna, thank you so much for your time today. It's really been an inspiring conversation. I've enjoyed it.
Well, thank you for having me, Mitch. I really think the world of the work you do and love to stay connected in the journey ahead.
You've been listening to my conversation with Regenerative World Quester Brenna Simmons-St, and she's going to continue her travels to regenerative communities for another couple of years, and you can follow along at bethelightconsulting.com. Be the Light Consulting is all one word, no space, no dash, bethelightconsulting.com. Each of us is on a quest, if we choose to be, toward a better world. One of the challenges the regenerative, sustainable economy faces relates to messaging. There is, correctly, I think, a debate about the shape of the future that we're building together. Many committed sustainability advocates argue that the answer is simply a matter of doing more with less. And while that is a truism that applies to the typical person considering a purchase of one among 30 to 50 different types of breakfast cereal or deodorant, the reality is that people want more than to just get by. So we have to find a way to describe and collectively achieve abundance. They want a better world. And we've generally associated better with having more for the past 150 years. In a sense, we've become locked in an iron mask of consumerism, counting what we accumulate, no matter how much of it's junk, instead of looking holistically at our lives to ask, what is the better choice that I can do more with? Whether that's choosing organically produced food, a durable sweater over fast fashion, or choosing a form of transportation. Brenna's quest is an opportunity to squarely look at the rampant consumerism and, it's important to note here, the potential for global gentrification through the lens of our personal values. Are we going to participate in that? Are we going to make this a better world? She and her family are learning to integrate into the places they visit, not just to extract experience and resources without giving back. And that giving back can come in many forms. You might visit Costa Rica and choose to teach in that country, or contribute to the preservation of smallholder farms, or start a fair trade coffee roaster that pays good wages to the migrants who pick many of the beans that we so savor. Brenna mentioned that several of the communities that she visited were, in fact, cults wrapped in the flag of sustainability. Just like many of the early sustainability goals declared by corporations only to be abandoned when the political winds changed. We have to do more than put on a nice coat. We have to actually change ourselves. You should subscribe to Brenna's feed to hear more about the cults and those genuinely sustainable communities that the family discovers. But let me ask you to think about this as you read along. Where does the excess, the abundance that Brenna described come from? And I put it to you, it comes from within us. It might be the labor or generosity I mentioned a moment ago, but most of it comes from our creativity and the love that we share with others and the planet. We have plenty of that to give, and the reward is a flourishing world if we choose wisely with a long view, one that looks, for instance, 7 generations ahead, as in the indigenous traditions. All of us are on journeys. All of us face choices, and we're all looking for what will make things better for our children, grandchildren, and the descendants that we'll never know. And they will look back on this pivotal time in history and ask, did those people, those grandparents, great grandparents, and ancestors of mine choose well? Did they do better? The resolution of our personal quest lies far in the future, not at the moment when we leave this world and count the piles of stuff accumulated during our lives. So start your personal regenerative quest. Start it at home, start it in the kitchen, start it in the yard. Think about what we're doing and give back to this planet, and it will give us generations of value to come. And I hope you'll take a moment to look at the more than 500 episodes of Sustainability in Your Ear that we produce, and share them with your friends and family. Writing a review on your favorite podcast platform, folks, will help your neighbors find us. You are the amplifier that can spread more ideas to create less waste. So please tell your friends, family, and coworkers they can find Sustainability in Your Ear on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, or whatever purveyor of podcast goodness they prefer. Thank you for your support. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. This is Earth911, and we will be back with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, folks, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.